All right, I think we're ready to get started. Hello, everyone. My name is Zach Ferkalo, and I'm the editor-in-chief of Volume 4 for the Journal of Law and Innovation. I'm thrilled to see such a great turnout for Session 1 of the journal's 4th annual symposium, Innovation in a Time of Crisis. For those of you who are unfamiliar with JLI, it functions as Penn's only academic journal that is both student and faculty run. In the fall of each year, faculty members from Penn's Center for Technology, Innovation, and Competition lead a discussion-based seminar that allows journal members to explore the intersection of law and tech. The purpose of the seminar is not only to foster a sense of community among Penn Law students interested in tech, but to do so with an eye towards legal academia, as student editors learn to analyze scholarly works in preparation for this symposium and its resulting journal volume. This year, led by Professor Polk Wagner, we focused on the various ways in which times of crisis have created unique challenges for innovators and innovation policymakers. We are therefore ecstatic about our speakers today and tomorrow, who will touch on a wide range of topics pertaining to innovation in response to crisis. In the interest of time and not keeping you from our wonderful presenters, I would like to say a few quick but necessary thank yous to the people who made this day possible. First, Caroline Olson, the Managing Director of Penn Law's CTIC, and Carlin Miller, Penn Law and CTIC Event Coordinator. I can safely say that without them, there would be no symposium here today. Second, I want to thank Emily Losey and Ben Nichols, both members of the journal's executive board in charge of overseeing the symposium. Emily and Ben have worked tirelessly to make this event happen. Third, Professor Wagner, who has helped us untangle the complicated web that is innovation policy last semester. And fourth, our wonderful participants for being here today. And lastly, all of you in the audience. I'm sure you will make the symposium all the more engaging and interesting, sparking new ideas that will lead to a better Volume 4 for JLI. Before I turn it over to Professor Wagner, we have two small housekeeping announcements. First, we want to make you aware that we are recording today's symposium. Second, we have had to make a slight schedule change due to the power outages caused by the current storm. Professor Sapna Kumar's presentation, Promoting Public Health Through State Sovereign Immunity, has been moved from today's session to tomorrow's session. As a result, today's session will end early at approximately 7:30 p.m. For anyone who is registered for CLE credit tonight, but was not planning to attend tomorrow's session, please reach out with an email and we will make our emails available during the breaks. Okay, thank you all, and we look forward to a great symposium. Now, I would like to turn it over to our faculty advisor for Volume 4 of the Journal of Law and Innovation, Professor Wagner. Professor Wagner.
Thank you, Zach, and thank you for the kind introduction, and welcome to all of you to what I think is going to be an amazing event, and I've been looking forward to this for a long time. As Zach noted, the Journal of Law and Innovation is a unique type of journal, and frankly, a unique type of organization at Penn Law, and it's a true partnership between the faculty of the Center for Technology, Innovation, and Competition and the students. And we've had a great time over the past several months. The beginnings of this conference were really last May when we started talking about topics and meeting to discuss various ideas of how to run the conference and the types of things we wanted to do. And as Zach noted, what we did all fall was talk about all of these issues in a seminar format in detail, and indeed many, in fact, most of the speakers and papers presented today were chosen by the students because of their interest in the speakers' works that they had read last fall, which I think is a really unique and really interesting way to do an academic conference, and one that I found for myself to be really fulfilling. But the best part for me of the entire exercise has really been working with this great group of students. So Zach, of course, as the editor-in-chief, has been tireless and shown exceptional leadership all along. Emily and Ben have worked incredibly hard over the last few months to put this all together. The rest of the Journal of Law and Innovation editors were both excellent participants in the fall seminar, as well as really helping behind the scenes at put all of this together. So Without further ado, I'm going to turn this over for a couple brief remarks from the director of Penn Law's Center for Technology, Innovation, and Competition, Professor Christopher Yu, who's going to welcome us as well.
Well, thank you very much, Polk. And I have to say that this is a proud moment for me and all of us at the Center for Technology, Innovation, and Competition. JLI really personifies a value that we're trying to promote. It's a place where the entire law and technology community of Penn Law comes together. And it reflects a vision of an integrated community that I think is quite rare. You often see faculty having their own circle of events and students having their own. This is really an area where students and faculty, teaching and research, and all the different dimensions of what we do come together. And I think it's been a labor of love for many, many people who've been led this journal in the past 3 years, who helped found it, and then now who are making it such a success today. I want to thank you, Polk, for making this possible, for being the faculty leader and editor. Thank the speakers today, Sean and Rachel, for agreeing to be part of this, because obviously this is an academic conference and it's an integral part of what we do. Thank all the students and Zach, Emily, Ben, and Carlin and Caroline, and the rest of the staff, and Carlin and Caroline, who, as Zach said, make everything possible. And really, I do want to spend a special thanks to the students, because since the beginning of this conference, the students have really made it a special community, it is the place where people, all students who are interested in law and technology, come together, and they find a place where they gather with other people who share their interests and really make it a focal point of the life here in the school. You can never take that for granted. It's something that has to reinvent itself every year. And it's something that we have seen every single year of the journal's existence. And that's something that I do appreciate deeply, that the students, for their commitment, but also just for the love of the subject matter, for making it come to life. It really plays an integral role in making the journal and CTIC and law and technology at Penn generally the success story that it is. Love to spend the rest of the next 2 days, 2 evenings with you, but I will stop talking now because we have much more important things to do with Sean's presentation and then Rachel's. And with that, I will hand it over to Emily Losey, who will introduce our first speaker.
Thanks, Professor Yu. Hi, everyone. I'm Emily Losey. I'm the Symposium Operations Editor for JLI, and I'm excited to introduce our first presenter for tonight, Professor Sean O'Connor. Professor O'Connor, a noted innovation law scholar, is currently a professor of law and the executive director of the Center for the Protection of Intellectual Property at George Mason University, Antonin Scalia Law School. Previously, he was the Boeing International Professor of Law at the University of Washington School of Law in Seattle. Professor O'Connor's research focuses on intellectual property and business law with regard to startups and commercializing technology and arts innovation. His teaching and law practice specialize in transactions and the strategic role of the general counsel. Professor O'Connor received his law degree from Stanford Law School, a master's degree in philosophy from Arizona State University, and a bachelor's degree in history from the University of Massachusetts. He is currently completing a book, The Means of Innovation, Creation Control Methodology, and serving as editor for a new handbook of music law and policy, both to be published by Oxford University Press. Professor O'Connor's presentation today is titled Controlling the Means of Innovation, and Professor Wagner, who we previously heard from, will be serving as the commentator for the presentation. So without further ado, Professor O'Connor.
Great, thank you. I want to thank Chris Yu and Polk Wagner, and most especially the students, for inviting me to come in and speak to you all and make this presentation. I hope everyone can see and hear me okay. If any issues arise, reach out to the chat or say something out loud in case something goes wrong. As you heard from the bio that was presented, this is actually part of a book project. And so what I'm going to try to do in 15 minutes is give you an overview of the book. And I think that even though the book project has been going on for more years than it should have, it's really become more timely when I realized that the crises we're facing underlying all of them is that we really need to think about our innovation policy a little more, and that what has really happened is we've shifted from thinking about the means of production in the Industrial Revolution into thinking about the means of innovation. So I'm going to share my screen now. Hopefully this will work, and you will see the slides that I have. Okay, I'm hoping that's worked. No one's saying anything that it's not, so I'm going to presume it has. Okay, so innovation at a time of crisis, the big picture. So one of the insights I had when I was starting this book project was that while if you're a student of history as I am, and you're looking at the Industrial Revolution, and even looking back earlier to the Scientific Revolution, we were always thinking about new ways of doing things. But in earlier revolutions, like the Industrial Revolution, we were trying to figure out how to actually produce artifacts. So our main output was thinking about factories and producing widgets, producing articles of manufacture. And so if you look on the slide here, I'm characterizing that the means of production, the Marxist construct. And again, whether you like Marx's conclusions or not, the insight about the means of production and who gets to control it, I think is, one of the seminal things in intellectual history. So what are you thinking about with the means of production? Well, factories, manual labor, and raw materials from nature. But what's going on now, I would argue, in the knowledge age and thinking about the fourth, industrial revolution, whatever you want to use for terminology about what's going on now, in my view, it really is about we're trying to figure out who's going to control the means of innovation themselves. So we've jumped up a level from worrying about how we do the ground level innovation. I want to create a new machine to do X. Instead, I want to think about now, how do I create a new way of designing new machines? So I'm thinking about design methodologies, things like that. Okay, that's really going to be emphasized quite a bit in the AI revolution, that despite the fact that people, when they think about artificial intelligence, they want to jump right down to artificial general intelligence, and the machines are going to take over everything and design everything. We're not quite there yet, but where we are right now is that inventors and creators are very much using AI tools to augment their creation and invention. And so that's part of this construct of the means of innovation. So again, to be very clear, what we're worried about now is the tools that we use to do innovation. And so who gets to control those? And intellectual property is of central concern to that, because we're thinking about protecting methods, business methods, legal methods, tax methods, things like that. That is really what I'm talking about, this intermediate level. So if we're shifting to the means of innovation as the thing that we're struggling to control right now, rather than factories, manual labor, and raw materials, now we're looking at technology-based tools, including AI, creative labor or knowledge labor, okay, not manual labor, and then using human-produced artifacts as the raw materials, not necessarily raw materials from nature. So again, another way of saying this, if in the first order of innovation, the sort of lower level, more concrete level in the Industrial Revolution, we were innovating to speed up production of what were traditionally back then handmade objects, and then we're going to use powered machines to make objects. We started thinking about interchangeable parts, assembly lines, so all ways of producing artifacts more quickly and more efficiently. But the second order, where we are now with the means of innovation, is what could also be called the design revolution. So we're focusing on how we do the designing, inventing, and creating. And then one of the big hot topics really is, do people get to own, through intellectual property and other means, own and control those means of innovation? Now, some of this can be traced, I'm not going to do a lot of the history because I don't have a ton of time here, but some of it can be traced back to German Bauhaus and Scandinavian furniture, where they were starting to look at how do we innovate our design principles themselves. And then the rise of design schools, Stanford's, RISD, MIT's Media Lab, these are all places that you're looking at, again, the innovation process itself. And it's not just product design, but it's service design, innovations in banking, legal services, accounting. Okay. And this has led to, so one of the reasons I started on this project many, many years ago was because I realized that a lot of the hottest topics in patentable subject matter were method patents, research methods, business methods. These were things that were getting people quite upset. And my intuition on it was that if you're design a new widget, it's a new artifact, you're like, good on you. You invented that new machine. Okay, you got that, go for it. But when it's something that people can do themselves, they see the process, the method you've developed, and now you're saying, I'm the only one that exclusively can do that, that seems to rankle people in a different way. Okay. Now, a different part of the project is that I also started realizing that really all innovation, in my argument, it's all about methods. So even though when we say, what technology are you using? And we think about a computer or the actual artifact or an iPhone or something like that. My argument is that it really is the methods. The only reason we care about those artifacts is that they're methods of doing things. And so in fact, most artifacts are what I would call embedded methods. Even things like pharmaceuticals, like pills. You take a pharmaceutical to make you better. The pill in and of itself has no intrinsic value. It's only the fact that you can take it in certain doses and it will help you with some ailment. Okay? But methods exist, at least in my accounting, at different levels of generality. One of the problems for in patentable subject matter and the problem of abstraction is that the courts, especially the Supreme Court, try to treat it as if it's just binary. Something's either abstract or it's not. And they're not fully grappling with the problem that there's different levels of abstraction. And honestly, all patents are abstract in the sense of once you translate something that's know-how that you're actually doing in the world into words and you describe it or into images, that's already a first level of abstraction. So all of our patent documents, everything we think about as the patent itself is already a level of abstraction. So it's not about whether the method or what's going on is abstract or not, it's how abstract it is, what level of abstraction. That leads me then to be creating or arguing we should create this field of methodology that I'll turn to in just one second. But it also leads me to define, not that we need another definition of innovation, but I'm taking a crack at it anyway, defining innovation as new problem-solving methods. So that's really what's going on. Okay, we have problems, we have methods that we do to try to solve those. But one issue, one fundamental challenge for intellectual property is that we look and we say, well, look, people were inventing things and creating things before IP systems came about. So why do we need IP for that? It was happening before then. And so what I argue is that what intellectual property arose for was to then get that innovation so that people would put it out in publicly available means, not necessarily for free, but to encourage them not to keep it and use it secretly or in private contexts. Another point that I think is important about innovation is that it's evolutionary in the sense that we're not progressing to one kind of, fittest method for doing something for all times and places. Instead, we're always looking at changing dynamic background conditions, and then we innovate to deal with those background conditions. And then 5 years later, the background conditions change and we have to innovate some more. In this proposed field of methodology that I'm working on in the book, I'm arguing that you can categorize all human activity related to innovation in three what I'm calling meta methods. The first one is I'm using three terms for it because they come from different backgrounds, but they're all related to the same idea. Study, and in an older sense of the word science, was just to make a systematic study of something. So don't think about modern science where it's people in lab coats and very formal, chemistry, physics, this and that. The term scientia, the old Latin term, just came from I'm stepping back, I'm observing, and I'm learning about things, but I'm not affecting change in the world. I'm not manipulating materials or forces to do anything. So when you're taking a study approach, then whatever field you're looking at, whatever phenomena you're looking at, that's the object of your study. Two is production or art or making. And the word art, and this is the one that's been the most sort of bastardized over time, before the late 1800s, art meant any kind of artifice, any artificial things that humans produced. So you could have the useful arts, and think about that term in the IP clause, that was for mechanical things, making things that had functional utility. The fine arts was instead things based on aesthetics. The liberal arts were ways of education. So we had lots of different arts fields. But what they all had in common was that you were having human intervention with materials or forces in nature to do things for aesthetic or useful purposes. So in that case, the field of what you're doing is the subject of practice. And the third one that I think is the most overlooked, because for a long time we've been talking about so-called arts and sciences, but organization and law itself in a way of structuring human relationships. So I'm using law in a broader sense of all the ways that we order our relationships with each other. And then even thinking about the old Roman law construct of structuring relationships among people, places, and things. Technology, I argue, is not one of the high-level meta methods, because instead it's one of these a mediating thing. And if you look at, as I have at the actual roots of the term, it really was literally technology. Techne being the old Greek term for arts in the sense of skilled craftsmanship. And so it literally was technology, the study or science of craft. Now, if we start putting this together, and again, this is just a very quick cursory overview of what is a book-length topic, the means of innovation for me comes together when you look on this pyramid here of here's your production on one face of the pyramid, organization and study, and they interplay off each other. So I want to produce a new artifact in the world, something that's going to be helpful, but I may need to then study the phenomenon first before I can go into my production mode. And then I'm going to need a team of people to produce it or even to study it. So I'm always toggling back and forth among these areas. And so if you look over here then at the levels of methods, the meta method sits at the top, and then you have high level purposive concepts for that field, mid-level design tools, low level, the process described in words and images, and then concrete at the bottom is actually doing it in the world. I'll give a quick example because a very concrete example often helps. If we think about something age-old human skill of starting fires, igniting fires, we know that under the modern kind of scientific account that we give to kids, in school kids, we say, well, you need ignition, oxygen, and fuel to start a fire. And that's kind of what I call the sort of science version of fire starting. And that's true, and it's really helpful for many purposes, but what it's not helpful for is if you're in, like a snowy, rainy woods at night and you need to start a fire. Then knowing that you need ignition, oxygen, and fire isn't immediately helpful to you. So that's the higher level. Emily's coming in, so I have, 3 minutes left? Perfect, that's good. I'll get to my example and then move on quickly here. Go to the other extreme, and now we think about the ways we actually do it in the world. So I can show someone through complete show how. I don't have to use any words. I'll get my little flint rock and I'll create sparks, and I'm relying on the air in the atmosphere. I don't really understood that if I'm a very sort of simple primitive person, but the phenomena happens. And then I have wood, things that I put together, and that's how you start a fire. Innovation happens because we jump up and we say, okay, I was doing a particular thing in the world, and then I generalize, I abstract out, and I realize that sticks will create friction as well, or create sparks. And then I create this concept, this mid-level concept of friction. And then I realized that, well, that's really ignition, because then later when we develop electricity can create sparks and things as well. Chemical things can create sparks as well. So you get the idea. You have these mid-level methods, higher level, very conceptual methods, and then these are all the ways in which we think about things. So what is this methodology field? Well, it's really a way to analyze and construct orders of methods. And this will help us then as we're thinking about both innovation itself and also our legal analysis. And in particular, look at this, the bottom bullet point. My argument that coming out is going to be that we need to be, and policymakers think about where on the level of the kind of ladder of abstraction, these increasingly abstract methods, where do we pin the level at which we say above that, there's no IP protection. IP protection is really designed for the lower level, very concrete things, not higher levels of abstraction. And so not only wrap up with the themes going forward and the struggle for the control of means of innovation is that now what we're really looking at, and I won't have time to go through all 5 categories, but firm to individual, and think about this as non-competes. So a lot of the debates you're seeing right now in the innovation space, you can put them all into this box, this construct of struggle for the control of means of innovation. So non-competes, things like that, are where firms are trying to control the innovation of individuals. Firm to firm. Now we have things where companies are trying to sort of tie each other up or do things to each other so that they can control the means of innovation almost in a cartel-like way. State to individual, how do we then have the state interacting with individuals? State to firm, think about antitrust. And the last one, state to state, think about technology leadership, like China versus the US. So let me end there because I think I'm out of time, but I just wanted to give you a taste of this larger book project and say, I think this is really what we need to be focusing about when we're thinking about innovation in a time of crisis. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Professor O'Connor. And now we have some commentary from Professor Wagner. And just a reminder, if anyone has any questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A now, and we'll go through them after Professor Wagner's comments. Thank you.
Excellent. All right. Thanks, Emily. That was great. And thanks, Sean. That was, I think, a really interesting talk, a really interesting paper, and I think a particularly apt one to sort of start out our conference with. in talking more broadly about innovation, and in particular, learning more about how innovation works, right? The idea of what I found striking was, which I think is right, your connection of the sense that we don't think hard enough or perhaps deeply enough about learning about ways of innovation, and we focus, potentially too much on the outputs, right? What it is that actually gets produced in terms of the ideas, the concrete, the tangible objects, as opposed to the more abstract approaches to the ways that we innovate. And so I have a couple questions that maybe we could chat about. So, as I sort of boiling down your project, it seems to be, a call to have almost a field of study of innovation about innovation, right? How are we to think and organize ourselves around not so much the innovations themselves, but on processes, methods, approaches, and as you described, just basically a field of study about innovation in and of itself. So in drawing this down a little more to the sort of topic of the conference, let's talk about it last year, right? So looking through your lens, your methodology lens, learning about innovations about how to innovate, what have we learned over the last year? Obviously, there's been a tremendous amount of sort of those concrete, low-level versions of innovation that you talked about, right? There's been obviously new technologies with regard to pharmaceutical drugs and other treatments for disease. The technology we're all using right now to do this webinar has come an amazing distance in the last years, and we've all learned how to use it. So what is it that you would point to, or what things have you seen going on that you would describe as new ways of thinking about how to innovate?
Yeah, it's a great question. And let me make a preliminary response, which is that in the paper and in the book, I go through quite a bit about many fields have their own methodology within them already, but a lot of fields don't necessarily have a well-developed methodology. My overall methodology would be, can we do universal things across different fields? But then to get to your question about thinking about the pandemic over the past year and what's happened there, look at fields that do have very robust methodologies, like the pharmaceutical research development pipeline. They think about their methodology all the time. And so that's why it's kind of no surprise that they were able to, in record time, put together vaccines. Look at other things like hoarding toilet paper, right? Sort of weird other supply chain disruptions. Now, those were places where I would argue, if my theory is correct, that people are probably not focused on their methodology quite enough. They hadn't thought about within their field how they innovate. And so the innovation was more sort of sporadic. People just do it intuitively. They haven't worried about it as its own field of study.
So do you think about this in terms of like a practice, like that this, the pharmaceutical industry or the pharmaceutical research community obviously has a lot of practice, right? They do this all the time. And so therefore they have sort of this path that they know how to follow, right? Which when a crisis hits, they can sort of hop on the path and, maybe they go a little faster than usual, but really they're following basically the same path that they've done before. Whereas some of these other areas that we turn out to need a bunch of very fast innovation in, I mean, things from logistics, right? We obviously have serious supply chain issues, right? That haven't innovated as fast. Travel and transportation, it doesn't seem like we've gone very far on a lot of those yet. And is it because those fields don't have the practice to it? And if so, is it something that as you, I think, said in your sort of preliminary response to me, is it something that is your sense that they can look at the pharmaceutical industry and say, hey, they have methods of how to innovate that we can transport to our area? Or is it not a sort of transferable skill in that way?
No, it's exactly that. So the methodology, the way we'll analyze fields, then becomes its own tool that can be used almost iteratively upon itself. And let me say what I mean by that. So in some of the fields like logistics, where it seems like things haven't happened quite as well, the innovation that happens there can be more sporadic. So in other words, there's not a whole science already in that field about how you do the innovation in that field. In the pharmaceutical realm, largely because it's influenced quite a bit by research universities and very advanced science type folks, then they've thought a lot about their methodology, the ways that they're going to innovate, and that allows them to innovate more rapidly. So methodology then as a field would look across advanced methodologies in particular places like take pharma and other things that have been very successful, and then say, okay, are there tools that we can abstract out of that then could be applied by somebody else in a different field? So essentially people could then be trained in methodology in that way to then, it's like applying economics to a new field. Where you've already applied it to a field, that field probably does better. It's more efficient because it understands economic principles. Same thing. A field that hasn't applied it you can make some serious inroads. So
Right.
methodology, that's what you would do. Use it to analyze a field, speed up innovation in that field.
Yeah. And why do you think that we haven't sort of developed? I saw, the one statement on your last slide sort of jumped out at me, this innovation producer, right? Like, why do we not have at this point sort of a field or a study of innovation or a profession, right? Where somebody's profession is, as you say, sort of translating approaches, ways, methods of innovation from area to area or industry to industry and bringing it sort of down at that level. Why do you think that that's not something that we see? Why is it that people are staying, it seems like, very much inside their silos, right? I mean, you certainly do have people that specialize in innovation in a particular field itself. And I'm sure even in logistics and toilet paper manufacturers, they have people who are in charge of innovation, right? But they're not like learning, or they're not doing it, I think, in the way that you would hope that they do, right? And so why do you think that is?
So I think part of it is that innovation and entrepreneurship, and those are two different concepts, but we often kind of blend them together. But in both those things, there's still, I think, too many folks out there who think of them as things like sales or maybe musical ability or things. Yeah, you can kind of train it, but you're either born with it or you're not. And so that's part of our challenge. And so we haven't systematically looked enough at the innovation process. And why I distinguish innovation and entrepreneurship too, if you take William Baumol's construct about distinguishing replicative entrepreneurship from innovative entrepreneurship, replicative is where I'm just doing a new pizza shop. I'm probably innovating a little bit, but it's pizza, whereas innovative entrepreneurship is, no, I'm going to create a whole new good or service that didn't exist before.
Yeah.
So, we're still early in that stage of developing all that. And so what the best innovators and entrepreneurs, honestly, are ones who do what I call the ladder of abstraction approach, where they're able to say, I'm deeply in a field, here's a problem here. How do I jump up levels of abstraction and go look to another field that seems completely different, but go down their ladder of abstraction and see what particular ways they've solved the problem. So I think we just haven't systemized enough. So particular fields have done a pretty good job, but others just haven't done this yet.
And so then the patent guy in me wants to say, well, it seems like we should just make these methods of innovation patentable, and then everything will work out fine, right?
Well, if you want to incentivize that people actually develop them and then publicly disclose them, and yeah, that's the battle royale that's coming, though, is at what level of abstraction. The first thing is to get the Supreme Court and others away from thinking about abstraction as binary. We need to get them thinking about levels of abstraction, which is what methodology would do. And then the really tough battle is going to be, where are we going to set that level at which above it, we think it covers too many instances. And so somebody gets the patent there and they own innovation across all spaces.
Yeah. Yeah, I can see a bunch of my 1L IP students are here, and we just did Mayo and Alice this week. So I think our chances of convincing the Supreme Court to think about this in a more sophisticated way is slim to none, but we can hope, right?
Hey, maybe I get the book out and maybe people actually read it, and maybe it'll move the needle a tiny bit,
Yeah, there you go. We can all hope. So Emily, we're probably due to switch over to some general audience Q&A, right? Okay.
Yeah, so we have a couple questions from the audience. Going off of this discussion about the levels of abstraction, someone asked if you, Professor O'Connor, have a proposition for the levels of abstraction that should be covered by IP protection and levels that should not be. And they asked, is it different, do you think, for different areas of innovation? For example, should something like life sciences be treated differently than the computer sciences?
Yeah, I'm going to say something that may go against in some ways. I'm generally a fairly pro-IP person. And so Professor Wagner might not even like what I'm going to say. I think he and I are generally the same position. But on this, the more I think about it, the more I think that I level of IP protection should be set pretty low, pretty close to the very specific ways you do things. Because as soon as you jump up any level of abstraction, like take my fire starting example. So somebody gets to patent the idea that, friction is what creates the ignition you need for fire. That becomes problematic. Now, I think that we can, and not to get too deep in the weeds of patent law, but you can cover it a bit by looking at whether you've enabled in that whole mid-level abstract thing. So if you haven't really thought through all the ways that you can use friction to create sparks, then maybe you just fail. So maybe we can say you still could get the patent at that level, but if you haven't fully enabled across that whole sphere, then no, you fail for that reason. So I think maybe using that enablement, that could be a trick to let us go up further levels of abstraction. But my intuition would be to keep it quite ground level, ways that people actually do things and that they can show and demonstrate that they've actually achieved that particular method.
Great, thank you. And so another question we had was actually about the music industry. And this person wanted to ask if you think that the music industry is more focused on innovation or on artifacts at the moment?
That's a really great question, and it's playing to my other side of doing music stuff. Teaching music law right now, actually. Situations have forced the music industry to be more about innovation than about artifacts. Because look, just the artifacts we used to have in the music industry were records, CDs and things. And now that's kind of out the window, right? So now we have very ephemeral stuff, digital transmissions. And we're also looking at, even doing digital downloads. There's a lot of piracy and other stuff going on. And even if it's legitimate streaming through Spotify, the revenues are very, very low. So we're looking at how do we innovate to then think about it's more about the performances. So really, necessity
well, and
is
of course,
invention.
even those have significantly changed in the last year, right? I mean, you can't do concerts the way you used to. So
right. So but the clever thing is people doing live streaming. We've really, in my household, we're a big fan of Brandi Carlile, partly because we've been in Seattle for so many years. But, she and her band have pivoted wonderfully. I mean, I don't know if they're actually, I don't know anything about their revenues, but it seems like they're keeping the lights on, and it seems like they're saying they're keeping a lot of their staff, even the roadies who would have been taken on the road, they're keeping them at least somewhat paid by doing live streaming. And so that pivot was pretty amazing to do that. That's just pure innovation right there.
Yeah, definitely an industry that's been majorly affected by the pandemic. And then another question we had, and I think this will be the last question, is what do you see as the next major revolution that might happen? So, we had the Industrial Revolution to the Design Revolution. Next, is it going to be a data revolution with the Internet of Everything? I guess, what do you see on the horizon?
Yeah. I think what you are going to see is the development of AI and how we do the handoff between what the human input is on that and what the machine learning part is. Even though, as I said quite clearly, we're not at the point now of general artificial intelligence with the machines taking over. But on the other hand, we are very much using those things as tools. And one thing in a very concrete IP aspect I'm looking at, are arguing that a lot of the questions right now about, well, is AI inventions created by AI patentable? Are artistic creations copyrightable? And my answer is that, what's going to happen pragmatically, I think, is that businesses and individuals are going to, as long as they're the ones overseeing, they're using the machines to do a particular invention, they're directing the invention, at least conceptually, or they're directing the artistic output conceptually. It really is just on the copyright side, work made for hire. And on the patent side, almost a species of hired to invent, that kind of common law doctrine. And there's going to be no interest of human producers and companies to reveal that the role that AI played. They're just going to be like, no, look, we still. So go back to the producer construct. That's why I'm big about that innovation producer, just like a movie producer who pulls together all the parts to make sure the movie gets made overall. And so I think that's what you're going to see is really the next revolution is going to be is that is it going to be a very small number of people then that have the overall vision for something, and then they have a lot of automated tools, AI and other things. But then what happens to lots of people who would otherwise have been employed? So we're continuing having to think we're losing employment in that way.
Right. That was my thought as you were talking, is that this sounds like another version of sort of the knowledge revolution, right? Where people went from making things to to, making ideas about things. And if we move everybody up one more level, because we're teaching machines how to come up with how to make things, then that's potentially even a smaller cadre of people, right?
Right. And
Of
even
course,
go
the
back
rest
to
of us
music.
then can just go to the beach and make music. So that'd be fun.
If we get paid, if we get covered, for our living thing. But this is something I lament a lot with music as well. You go back before recorded music and stuff, and every town had to have musicians to play in the dance band, and everyone had pianos in their home and stuff. And then you get rid of that, and suddenly you're getting rid of lots of jobs, and then you have social foment. And arguably, and I didn't have time to do it tonight, but that's why I think that a lot of what's going on right now, even if you take the a lot of the stuff going on in the country politically, a lot of it is because a lot of people are looking at, geez, where's my future in all this? And if it really is the knowledge elites out there, what's my role in all this? And we need to grapple with that, because that's not going to go away.
So you're ending your presentation with saying that innovation is going to cause a crisis as well as help us solve a crisis.
Well, yeah, in a way, that's what I'm saying, is that the real crisis, and this is what I was trying to, why I chose to do this topic, not something more like exactly COVID or whatever, is that the real crisis lurking behind this all is this controlling the means of innovation, is this change that's going on. And that then is leading to lots of the other things are really symptoms of it.
Well, thank you, Professor O'Connor, for your presentation and for answering all these questions. And Professor Wagner, thank you for your comments as well. So we're going to take a short 5-minute break, and then we will have our next presentation. But thank you so much for participating today.
Thank you all. Thanks.
Everyone, so we're going to get started with our second presentation. I'm excited to introduce Professor Rachel Sachs, the Assistant Professor of Law at Washington University in St. Louis School of Law. Professor Sachs is a scholar of innovation policy whose work explores the interaction of intellectual property law, food and drug regulation, and health law. Her work explores problems of innovation and access to new healthcare technologies. Professor Sachs's scholarship has appeared in journals that include the NYU Law Review, the Michigan Law Review, the Minnesota Law Review, Harvard Law Review, New England Journal of Medicine, and Journal of American Medical Association. Prior to joining the faculty at Washington University in St. Louis School of Law, Professor Sachs was an academic fellow at the Petrie-Flom Center for Health Law Policy, Biotechnology, and Bioethics, and a lecturer in law at Harvard Law School. She also clerked for the Honorable Richard A. Posner of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Seventh Circuit, and Professor Sachs received her J.D. magna cum laude from Harvard Law School and a Master of Public Health from the Harvard School of Public Health, before which she received her A.B. in Bioethics from Princeton University. And so Professor Sachs's presentation today is titled Encouraging Interagency Collaboration, Learning from COVID-19. And once Professor Sachs finishes her presentation, we'll have Professor Carey give commentary. So without further ado, Professor Sachs, thank you so much, and we're excited to hear your presentation today.
Thank you so much. I'm excited to be here, and thank you to the faculty and the really wonderful students for organizing this event. I also want to briefly apologize for any extraneous background noise. My toddler is living his best life downstairs, and there might be some associated noise. Just wanted to confirm that people can see the slides. I can see them. Someone could let me know in the chat. That'd be great. So my focus in this project is on the ways in which interagency coordination has both succeeded and failed in driving new healthcare innovations for COVID-19, specifically for diagnostic tests and for vaccines. I also consider what lessons can be learned from the successes and failures of these efforts about best practices in interagency coordination going forward. I do want to say I've been writing about this issue for a few years. So I have a 2018 Law Review article in the Cardozo Law Review about this question of interagency collaboration and health innovation generally. But then, of course, since the pandemic really began, I've been blogging extensively with colleagues. So with colleagues including Lisa Willett, Nicholson Price, and Jake Shirko, we've now published 31 blog posts and counting in the last year on various topics around innovation policy and COVID-19. And interagency collaborations have been a real theme, including in posts like these. If you're interested in learning more, Lisa's written description blog hosts all of these blog posts. So as someone who thinks a lot about innovation in the healthcare industry, I see the pandemic as a stress test, as many of our healthcare and innovation institutions. So typically a range of public and private sector actors all have to work together to bring a new health technology to market. And usually if they don't work together, maybe we don't notice it. Maybe something happens slower than it otherwise would, or maybe we don't notice the absence of the innovative technology that could have been discovered but wasn't. But the pandemic made these failures of interagency collaboration all too visible. And I think it's embodied for me in this relatively recent quote from former FDA Commissioner Scott Gottlieb. He was the FDA Commissioner, President Trump's first FDA Commissioner. He said, "What we needed was a coordinated response that involved contributions from multiple agencies. That didn't happen on testing or on a whole lot of other things." So first, I want to talk about testing. A robust diagnostic testing system for COVID-19 is essential to know where the virus is spreading and to put public health mitigation procedures in place. But failures of interagency collaboration early in the pandemic led to delays in the development of testing capacity in the US. So in January 2020, public health agencies were learning more about the virus. The CDC created its own diagnostic test and shared test kits with state public health labs. But there was a problem, and so the CDC quickly told state labs to stop testing using the kits. The problem is that for more than a month, the CDC was unable to solve the problem with the tests. The FDA should have been able to help, but often the agencies were at odds with each other. At one point, the CDC even blocked an FDA official from entering the CDC to try to help. For its part, the FDA wasn't able to clear new diagnostic tests that could have filled the void left by the CDC test, and independent lab certification requirements overseen by CMS, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. They also limited the set of labs eligible to do COVID-19 diagnostic testing. Interagency coordination between FDA, CDC, and CMS could have mitigated these delays. Not only could the agencies have worked together, but they all share a parent agency. They're all sub-agencies of the Department of Health and Human Services. HHS Secretary Azar could have taken steps to identify conflicts between these agencies and help accelerate the process, but reportedly he blocked efforts to do so. However, I do want to note that there have been much more positive examples of interagency coordination in the COVID-19 diagnostics area. So the NIH is leading the $1.5 billion Rapid Acceleration of Diagnostics, or RADx initiative, aiming to work with the CDC, FDA, and other agencies to speed innovation in the development, commercialization, and implementation of new COVID diagnostics. And so far, the results are fairly impressive. So one grantee, Illum, received the very first FDA authorization for a rapid at-home test that you can get over the counter. More recently, the federal government even signed a procurement deal with Illum, awarding $232 billion to the company in exchange for 8.5 million tests. And then even more recently, last week, the FDA authorized a test by another RADx grantee, Visby. This is the first rapid single-use PCR to be used at the point of care. And the steps involved in developing and disseminating this range of tests illustrates the importance of interagency collaboration in the success of RADx. So these companies not only have to deal with any scientific challenges, but they also need to get FDA authorization and scale up manufacturing of their products. And particularly for smaller startups with little experience with regulatory agencies, these challenges can be overwhelming. So the involvement in RADx of FDA and these other agencies is designed to help overcome these challenges. Second, vaccines. So the development and distribution of vaccines to prevent COVID-19 is important, obviously, in helping us move beyond the pandemic. And unlike with diagnostic testing, the Trump administration very quickly established a whole of government initiative, Operation Warp Speed, with the initial goal of developing or delivering 300 million vaccine doses by January 2021, very ambitious. Led by the Secretary of HHS and the Secretary of Defense, Warp Speed aimed to bring together officials from dozens of government agencies to accelerate the development of effective vaccines. Warp Speed met part of its goal, and in record time, the FDA granted emergency use authorizations for COVID vaccines from both Pfizer and Moderna in December 2020. And the support provided by Warp Speed to Pfizer, Moderna, and other manufacturers, it was both financial and logistical. So Warp Speed provided financial support to vaccine candidates or companies, both by encouraging at-risk manufacturing and by securing advanced purchases of the resulting vaccines. So Moderna, which had never brought a product to market before, accepted up to $483 million in funding to scale up manufacturing and support their late-stage clinical trials. Pfizer, which is already one of the world's largest vaccine manufacturers, did not accept this funding, although it did, as with Moderna, sign an advance purchase commitment with the United States government, among other governments. But Warp Speed manufacturers also received logistical and operational support. So Moderna relayed two notable issues that arose. I always find the second particularly interesting. So Moderna discovered that a specialized pump needed to make the first batches of vaccine for the clinical trials was marooned in a rail car and was not going to be delivered on time. Federal workers tracked down the train and rummaged through it until they found the pump. They put it on a plane and it arrived on time. The FDA can't do this, right? This is something that requires the unison and the collaboration of multiple different regulatory agencies. Any single agency could not have done all of the different things that Warp Speed was aiming to do for these companies. And so the unison of the agencies was essential. But we've also had some failures as well. So Warp Speed succeeded in bringing these effective vaccines to market in record time, but it did not succeed in meeting its stated goals around distribution. So administration officials said they planned to vaccinate 20 million people in December. Just over 3 million people received the vaccine then. And there are undoubtedly many contributors to the slow vaccine rollout, but at least some of the delays were due to failures of interagency collaboration. And in the paper, I focus on the example of long-term care facilities whose residents have been among the most vulnerable to severe illness and death during the pandemic. The CDC recommended that residents of long-term care facilities be among the first to be offered access to COVID-19 vaccines. And on December 13th, HHS Secretary Azar predicted that all nursing home residents could be vaccinated by Christmas. But as of the end of January, tens of thousands of residents around the country still had not received even their first dose of the vaccine. These delays in starting the vaccination process in long-term care facilities are due to failures of interagency collaboration. The problem is one of informed consent. So many residents of long-term care facilities have delegated their medical decision-making authority to a family member or third party. So the medical staff at the facility, they can't just ask each resident whether they would like to get a vaccine. They often have to communicate with an external authorized decision maker, and they have to do this dozens of times for dozens of residents. And so this process can take weeks or months. And this process of requiring informed consent was not only foreseeable, but it was foreseen. So HHS officials reportedly warned Operation Warp Speed that the process of consent would take time. They specifically warned that there should be high-level coordination within the government even before the FDA was deciding to authorize these vaccine candidates. But the process seemingly did not begin until after the vaccines had been authorized. So if Warp Speed had wanted to begin vaccinating residents of long-term care facilities sooner, it could have directed the required interagency coordination to begin earlier. So what do I think we should take away from these case studies? 3 main points. So first, the role of agenda setting power. And the lesson here is simple. The president and agency heads have great agenda setting power and can direct agency capacity toward their policy priorities. Relatedly, they can also signal that something is not a priority such that regulators cannot or will not address the issue. In the COVID-19 context, President Trump wanted very badly for the US to develop a vaccine as quickly as possible. At the same time, he often stated publicly that he did not want the US to develop a robust diagnostic testing capacity. The general form of this insight is not novel. The literature has already discussed the importance of presidential focus in interagency collaboration, but in this specific context, we can sharpen the broader point from the literature. So in the diagnostic contest, a large number of career officials very much wanted to develop accurate testing technology. And if agency heads had supported or even remained absent from this goal, diagnostic development might have proceeded. But where there was public opposition to this goal, career officials were unable to overcome this intransigence. Second, another potential distinction to draw between the diagnostic and vaccine case studies is the importance of organizational structure. How much of the failure of the early diagnostic rollout was due to the localization of the dispute within HHS, and how much of the success of Warp Speed was due to its higher level organization? It's tough to say, especially because it's intertwined with issues around agenda setting power, but when considering the ideal organizational structure for a particular innovation project, it may be important to consider the different tools needed to accomplish that goal and the institutional structures needed to bring those different tools to the table. So important elements of warp speed success likely came from its combination of scientific authority and logistical expertise, which arose only from the higher level work done by both HHS and the Department of Defense. In the paper, I talk about how this issue has applications for at least two broader issues in the literature. One is the idea raised in prior scholarship about the creation and role of an innovation regulator with some authority to coordinate innovation across agencies. And the second is the ongoing debate around whether the FDA should become an independent agency. Third, and finally, before I'm looking forward to comments on the paper, these initiatives may help highlight the importance of establishing a culture of collaboration across the relevant agencies. One study of collaborations between the NIH and other HHS agencies found that the most common method for initiating successful interagency collaborations was through personal connections and professional networks, with directives from leadership coming in second. But agency staff also reported that not knowing how to initiate such collaborations was a barrier to doing so. And together, the findings suggest that once these collaborative channels exist, those same staffers may be more likely to engage in collaboration in the future. Going forward, I argue that policymakers should consider ideas that would foster a culture of collaboration. And specifically, I talk in the paper about the idea of, I call them encouraging mandates. So as one example, Congress has instructed the NIH to report annually on its activities involving collaboration with other agencies within HHS. Congress has required the reporting as a way of encouraging the NIH to increase interagency collaboration, but the collaborations themselves are largely not mandated. And I propose amendments in the paper to the federal government's emergency powers that might encourage similar collaborative efforts. And with that, I'm very much looking forward to comments and questions.
Thank you so much, Professor Sachs. Again, just a reminder, if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A and we'll go through them after we hear some comments from Professor Colonnese. But just to give a short introduction to Professor Colonnese, he specializes in the study of administrative law and regulatory processes with an emphasis on the empirical evaluation of alternative processes and strategies and the role of public participation, technology, and business government relations in policymaking. He has authored several books, including Achieving Regulatory Excellence, Does Regulation Kill Jobs?, Regulatory Breakdown, The Crisis of Confidence of U.S. Regulation, Import Safety, Regulatory Governance in the Global Economy, Regulation and Regulator Processes, and Leveraging the Private Sector, Management-Based Strategies for Improving Environmental Performance. Professor Colonnese has also recently written on climate change policy, public participation, and transparency in federal rulemaking, the use of artificial intelligence by government agencies, and voluntary environmental programs. He was a founding editor of the peer-reviewed journal Regulation and Governance, and he founded and continues to serve as an advisor to the Regulatory Review. He holds a PhD in political science, a JD and Masters of Public Policy from the University of Michigan, and he received his AB from the College of Idaho. So Professor Colonnese, thank you so much for joining us today, and we're excited to hear your comments on Professor Sachs's presentation.
Well, thank you very much, Emily, and all of the organizers of today's symposium for inviting me. And thank you to Professor Sachs for this opportunity to think through these issues of agency collaboration, particularly in the current context related to COVID, and for helping all of us learn from the experiences of the last year in this space. The paper is, as is characteristic of Professor Sachs's work, incredibly informative and well written, and I really advise everybody to read it. One of the things that I think makes it quite important and unfortunately a little bit distinctive is that it's looking at both successes and failures. And I think a lot of legal scholarship often tries to build off of just one success story and then trumpet that as the solution to a lot of other issues. And yet we can learn as much, I think, from failures as we can from successes. And I think that's something that's truly distinctive and laudable about Professor Sacks's paper, about which I don't have a tremendous amount to take. I don't have anything to take issue with it. What I want to do with my comments is really just share with you some reflections that it prompted for me. And I want to, if we can distinguish between successes and failures, we want to make at least two other distinctions in my remarks. One is between what might be thought of as a crisis collaboration versus normal collaboration. And I think if we're going to draw lessons about collaboration and innovation more broadly, I think this is probably worth considering as an important distinction. What works for collaboration at a time when speed is paramount might not be what's needed in just sort of the normal, if you will, process of developing new technologies. Another distinction that I want to draw is between law and leadership. And I think this is reflected and totally compatible with Professor Sacks's work here. But let me just make maybe a few points. I mean, let me start off first by saying what may be relatively unremarkable is that disasters and crises often cut across different agencies and create the need for responses by multiple agencies. So COVID is not necessarily distinctive in that regard. We can look back to September 11th, 2001 and see that, there was a failure to connect the dots of it, bring together information about terrorist activities from across different agencies. Fast forward a bit to 2007, the financial crisis that occurred cut across a whole host of financial regulatory agencies. Then we, get the story that Professor Sacks is telling us about COVID in 2020 with NIH, CDC, FDA, and so forth. And we can quite frankly just look in the last 3 or 4 days at the crisis unfolding in Texas, for example, where we have federal agencies, FERC, and now FEMA, needing to get involved. We have at the state level the Texas Railroad Commission, which doesn't really just regulate railroads, but it's the utility regulator. And you have this private grid operator, the ERCOT, RTO, and so forth. So crises, I think, cut across agencies. That's sort of intrinsic. And I think crisis collaboration is something where you have a factor that matters in a way that doesn't perhaps in other contexts. The speed really matters. Now, the second point is that one typical response to failures of collaboration is to think about reorganization. And I think one thing that's fascinating to take away from Professor Sacks's paper is the contrast between what is the failure of collaboration that occurred in that story and the underlying theory behind the creation of the Department of Homeland Security after 9/11. There, the impulse was to bring together under one organizational structure, one department, 22 different agencies, the INS, TSA, Coast Guard, and so forth, with the thinking that they could collaborate better. And what's striking is that that theory, in some sense, is put to the test with COVID, where we have the Department of Health and Human Services that contains all of the agencies, as Professor Sacks says. They're sub-agencies, really, and yet they still couldn't coordinate. So I think one thing to note and draw from this experience is that you can have problems of lack of collaboration in sub-silos within agencies, and just putting them all under an umbrella doesn't really totally solve the collaboration problem. Let me close with a third point, and that is the difference between law and leadership. As I said, I think one response when we see failures of collaboration, especially in times of crisis, is for the Congress to reorganize. This is something that political scientists have long observed. Harold Seidman has a book from long ago, Politics, Position, and Power on the Dynamics of Federal Reorganization. More recently, Chris Kerrigan at GW has a book called Structured to Fail, which tells a really interesting story about how the Minerals Management Service went from a movement to consolidate, and then the Deepwater Horizon incident in the Gulf of Mexico occurred, and Congress then split it up. And both of these works in political science raise the question about whether reorganization is largely a symbolic gesture that Congress engaged in. And I think it raises some serious questions that we need to be careful about thinking that we can, through law, that is through the structure of agencies, solve these kinds of collaboration problems. I take away from Professor Sacks's story and from the experience of the last year that this, at least in times of crisis, when we need collaboration, crisis collaboration, there's going to be some limit to whatever the legal structure might be. And what is going to be most important is leadership. In some ways, what we should have had with COVID is the best case scenario for collaboration, because all of these agencies were within the same department, reporting to the same cabinet level secretary, who, by the way, had no for-cause protection from the president, right? So why did this collaboration fail here? I mean, I think it failed because of a failure of presidential leadership. And the various lessons that Professor Sacks, I think, quite wisely draws from this case, all really can point to the failure of presidential leadership, failure of the White House to set the agenda on the testing early on. The FDA was really just doing its job in making sure that new tests were approved and they were solid. You needed a president to really step in and say, there's speed here, there's a crisis, we've got to break out of our normal bureaucratic routines and speed up the process. The organizational structures or collaborations, again, the success story with the vaccine development was this was one of the areas where we actually benefited from White House leadership. And then the culture of collaboration, which suggests itself that this can't be something that's left exclusively to law to settle, but it requires people, leadership. Gene Bardek has a great book from the 1990s called Getting Agencies to Work Together. And he sees collaboration across agencies as really a problem of craft. And it's really ultimately a craft of leadership. So I thank you, Professor Sacks, for this terrific paper and for all that it sparks, I think, for all of us to think about what interagency collaboration requires, especially in a time of crisis. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I have to admit, I have not read that Bardic book on getting agencies to work together, but that's going on my list immediately. It sounds wonderful.
Thank you so much, Professor Colonese. So we do have a couple of questions. Going off of kind of this discussion regarding the White House and the executive branch, one of the questions we received was, do you believe that the politicization of the executive branch has impacted interagency collaboration? And if so, how do you think it's done that?
So there's certainly a way in which the upper level of the executive branch has always been politicized, and maybe it's been more politicized in recent years. But maybe I'll give one example where some political considerations maybe did impede interagency collaboration in this particular case. You know, I think it does seem from public reporting that HHS Secretary Azar, who, as we just heard, right, is subject to removal at will, he may have been responsive to the signals that he was receiving from the White House on what was being prioritized and on what the goals were around vaccination, but then also around diagnostics. And so it may have been that there was not the urgency to solve the diagnostic problem that we might have otherwise wished, and that some of that was coming for political reasons. But at the same time, you know, certainly this is something I talk about in the paper, but it's not it's important background context for what's going on, but it's not so integral to some of this. Through most of the last year, HHS has been meddling in the FDA's affairs in a whole range of areas: regular diagnostic tests, rulemaking authority, 510K review of some medical devices, review of genetically modified animals. There's a long footnote in the paper where I talk about this. But the point is that very recently, people have been urgently asking the question of, does the FDA need to be an independent agency? Maybe we've reached the situation where there's too political a leadership, at least in some cases, and the FDA needs to be insulated. There's an article by, I think it's Rachel Barkow, where she talks about how even though the head of the FDA is removable at will, and also there's no legal requirements as to who can be the head of the FDA, there's a very strong norm that it's a physician or a scientific expert or someone who has really broad support and who is going to make these decisions independently of interest group actors. And in every administration, that's mostly been adhered to, even Commissioner Gottlieb, Commissioner Hahn, that was true. And then the question is, what happens when HHS starts meddling in FDA's affairs? Now we may see, contrary to what we just talked about in terms of integration after emergencies, we may see a disintegration and a fragmentation of HHS if some of these pushes for FDA independence really gain steam.
Thank you. And one more question that we had was, would you say that there is a general timeline for how long it takes to establish a collaboration channel between agencies, or does this really depend on, the agency or the crisis at hand?
Well, it certainly depends on the agency and the crisis at hand, but what I will say is that in most of these cases, there are already collaborative channels that are open. And so one really great thing about the FDA is that they publish on their website all of the memoranda of understanding they have with other federal agencies. Right there, you can read them, you can see who the points of contact are, you can see what information sharing efforts they've agreed to engage in. And the FDA and NIH and CMS and CDC, they all have these relationships among each other. They've agreed to have, they talk about the kinds of information that they share. They were just authorized often just before the pandemic. And so there are these clear channels that are already set up for information sharing to occur. Now, not being on the inside myself, I can't say how often these are used, how sort of real they are, but the fact that they've been reauthorized very recently, and the fact that they tell people who to go to and what information to take and under what circumstances suggests that the broader channels are open. And then the question is that information actionable once it's presented, and do the agencies feel like they have the authority to make a change, whether for statutory or political reasons, and how can we move a particular innovation action forward?
Thank you so much for your presentation, Professor Sachs, and you, Professor Colonnesi, for your comments. I know that this has been really informative, and we really appreciate you both being here today. So thank you. And now I think we're going to show the last CLE slide, and then Zach is going to come on and give a few closing remarks.